My boy was trapped in an unheated sunroom on a freezing Thursday night. My older sister, Cressida, uploaded a picture of her fresh balayage hair color around the exact same time. The glass-paneled sunroom where they trapped him faces Mrs. Gable's property next door, and the overhead floodlight had been shattered by hail 2 months prior. He was wearing the astronaut onesie I shipped to him from my base overseas, the one with the frayed left cuff. He pounded on the glass. My stepfather heard him pounding. 8,000 miles away, I was chewing on stale flatbread in a mess hall, chuckling at a joke a medic made about the terrible coffee. I had absolutely no idea my entire universe had already fractured down the middle. By the time my phone actually rang, my mother had already spat out the words she could never unsay. Welcome back to Bloodline Betrayals, the space where folks find out that the person they brushed off was the exact one they should have feared. If this story makes you clench your jaw, that means you're paying attention. The first time I stood in that sunroom when the floodlights still functioned, it snapped on the moment I crossed the threshold. Orion was 5 back then. He figured the motion light was some kind of wizardry, pacing back and forth just to watch it illuminate. My mother glared from the kitchen boundary and muttered about the electricity bill. That was the autumn before my deployment papers dropped. The military doesn't let a solo parent ship out based on good vibes. You sign documents, and those documents carry weight. I sat at my parents' dining table with a tough-as-nails petty officer named Vance, filling out a family care plan, line by line. Who takes the kid when you're in the sand? The paperwork demanded. My parents. I initialed every single miserable page. Vance warned me most people treat the forms like a formality. I told him my kid isn't a formality. My mother shoved a bowl of pretzels at us and rolled her eyes.
Orion was 6 when I finally had to board the transport. He stood under that working floodlight in his oversized astronaut pajamas, waving his arms wildly like he was trying to guide a helicopter in for landing. I burned that image into my brain. You get really good at memorizing faces when your paycheck depends on leaving them behind. The car pulled away, the yellow light held steady, and I tricked myself into believing that steadiness meant he was safe. For the first few months, our video calls felt completely normal. Orion would jam his face into the camera lens, proudly displaying his missing front tooth like a trophy. My mother would hover in the background, griping about her arthritis, the humidity, and the price of groceries. Just ordinary complaints. Then, one Sunday, a 4th person wandered into the frame. Cressida. She had moved back home. Nobody bothered to tell me. I found out the way you find out everything when you're stationed overseas, by pure accident, always a step behind. There she was, draped in my mother's floral robe, sipping from my mother's mug, casually waving at the screen like a houseguest who never intended to leave. Cressida's engagement had imploded that winter. Her marketing job vanished shortly after that. Suddenly, her childhood home offered a free bed and a reliable monthly deposit, and my sister always had a shark's instinct for a free ride. Once she settled in, the tone of the calls shifted. My mother started bringing up finances with a weird, stiff rhythm, like she was reciting a script somebody else wrote. "Boys have bottomless stomachs," she'd say. She claimed the dependent allotment wasn't stretching as far as I thought. That allotment was the chunk of my salary the military wired directly to her account, specifically for Orion. I did the math myself. I knew exactly what it paid for, down to the cent. I didn't argue on the call. Fighting on a spotty connection from a desert base just teaches your kid that her mom is helpless. Instead of shouting, I watched. Cressida became a permanent fixture in the background of our calls, lounging on the sofa, scrolling on her phone, a constant shadow at the edge of the frame. Meanwhile, Orion got suspiciously quiet. He used to babble nonstop, telling me about bugs and cartoons and everything in between. Now he gave me one-word answers. He started darting his eyes off screen before opening his mouth. It's the exact look a person gives when they're terrified of saying the wrong thing in a hostile room. One evening, just before the connection dropped, he pressed his face close to the screen, so close his breath fogged the lens. He started whispering something frantic. Suddenly, Cressida's shadow fell over him, and my son snapped his mouth shut like a steel trap. I refused to let that sit. When morning hit my time zone, I messaged my mother demanding to speak with Orion privately. She claimed he was at baseball practice. I tried again the following day. She said he was doing homework. I make my living interpreting human behavior, and I know the difference between a real excuse and a barricade. This was a barricade, so I walked right around it. My parents live next door to Mrs. Gable, a retired middle school counselor who notices absolutely every detail on that block. I still had her contact info from a neighborhood barbecue 2 summers ago. I fired off a text, asking if she could casually knock on their door and just lay eyes on my kid for me. I didn't sugarcoat the situation. I told her I was miles away, losing my mind with worry, and I desperately needed a reliable adult to tell me he looked okay. Mrs. Gable replied within an hour. She had used a fresh batch of snickerdoodles as an excuse to visit. She noted that Orion answered the door himself, which she found alarming, and that he looked pale and thin. Then came the sentence I read 40 times. He flinched when the hallway door slammed. "Call me ASAP." I started furiously typing a response to Mrs. Gable, but before my thumb hit send, my unit commander kicked the door open and announced we were mobilizing to a remote forward operating base at first light. Complete communication blackout. No personal phones, 10 agonizing days in the dark. I erased my long paragraph. I typed 3 words instead and sent them just as the network cut out. Watch him, please. 10 days without a signal is pure psychological torture when you know your kid is flinching at doors. I didn't waste that time praying. I spent it plotting. The forward base had one crucial asset I desperately needed, a paralegal clerk who knew exactly how the Family Advocacy Office operated back at the main installation. During a dead quiet night shift, I cornered him, and I asked the question that had been burning a hole in my chest. Can a deployed service member unilaterally change who holds their child? He nodded without hesitation. A family care plan isn't a prison sentence, he explained. The designated caregiver can be revoked and reassigned in writing. An attorney from the legal assistance office can draft the transfer from anywhere. I wrote down the exact forms I needed. I formulated a strategy to hand Orion over to my late husband's sister, Aunt Linnea, a grounded, fiercely protective woman living 2 towns over, who had begged to take him initially. I drafted my notes in a dusty tent using a red lens tactical flashlight so the glare wouldn't expose that I was awake. By the time our convoy returned to the main base, I had an ironclad legal folder started and a dead phone. I plugged it into a charger in the comms tent. The notifications flooded in like a slow waterfall. Spam emails, weather alerts, and one single voicemail from an unknown local number back home. It had been left 48 hours ago. I was physically pressing play when the shift supervisor yelled my name. The base commander needed me in his office immediately. I shoved the phone into my tactical vest, the voicemail completely unheard, and sprinted across the compound. This is exactly how that Tuesday night unfolded, pieced together later from Mrs. Gable, the Child Protective Services agent, and eventually my own son. My mother owned a vintage pearl brooch, a gaudy heirloom she paraded around during church. That evening, it vanished from her dresser. She ripped the bedrooms apart looking for it. Cressida trailed behind her, stoking the fire, whispering poison, and somewhere in that frenzy, my sister pointed her finger at the only human in that house who couldn't defend himself. Cressida claimed Orion was digging through the jewelry box. She tossed that accusation out casually, like dropping a lit match onto dry leaves. My mother cornered my 6-year-old in the hallway and screamed at him to produce the brooch. He cried, swearing he didn't know where it was, because he genuinely didn't. My mother glared at the child I brought into this world and delivered the words that ended our family forever. "You're a liar and a thief, just like your father," she hissed. "Thieves sleep outside." She dragged him by the arm to the back sunroom, shoved him onto the freezing tile in nothing but his thin astronaut pajamas, and deadbolted the glass door. The floodlight was broken, no heat, total darkness. He pounded on the glass. He sobbed into the wood frame, begging for forgiveness for a crime he never committed. My stepfather sat in his recliner with the TV blasting. He admitted later that he heard the crying, he heard the pounding, and then, eventually, the pounding stopped. That silence is the part I cannot forgive. I have tried, and I simply cannot. Mrs. Gable couldn't sleep that night. She's the kind of restless soul who drinks water by the kitchen window at midnight out of pure habit. Glancing across the property line, she spotted an unnatural lump on the floor of my parents' unlit sunroom, a small shape sitting with its knees pulled tight against the freezing air. At first, she assumed it was a discarded trash bag. Then the lump shivered. Mrs. Gable didn't dial my parents' number. A veteran school counselor knows exactly when a family is trying to cover up abuse. She told me later that her gut screamed calling the house was a mistake. If she called, whoever answered would drag him inside and invent a lie before she could cross the yard. Instead of calling, she threw her heavy winter parka over her nightgown, marched across the frosty grass in her slippers, and found my boy. He was curled into a tight ball on the freezing tiles, his little fingers locked together so rigidly they wouldn't open. He was conscious. That's the detail that haunts my sleep. He was awake, but he wasn't crying anymore, because at 6 years old, he had figured out that screaming for help was utterly useless. Mrs. Gable practically tackled the door until the lock gave way, scooped him up, and wrapped him inside her massive coat. She dialed an ambulance from her own cell phone right there on the floor, rocking him against her chest and singing old nursery rhymes to keep his eyes open. The paramedics arrived in under 6 minutes for a small town. They loaded him into the rig and begged Mrs. Gable to keep talking to him. She rode with him all the way to the ER, talking about her old classroom fish cake just to keep him anchored. At the hospital doors, a grim-faced social worker intercepted them with a clipboard. Her very first question was demanding the location of the child's legal guardian. Mrs. Gable wiped tears from her face with the back of her hand, stared the woman dead in the eye, and told the brutal truth. She is defending her country overseas. Back in the desert, my commander didn't look at me when I entered his office. He had a printed dispatch on his desk. He gestured for me to take a seat. People in uniform do not ask you to sit down before delivering good news. The commander explained that a Red Cross emergency action message had just cleared the wire. He told me Orion was in a pediatric ward in Ohio, hypothermia. He was stable and being monitored, but the people entrusted with his life were the exact reason he was hooked up to IV fluids. The social worker had escalated the crisis immediately. It flew up the military chain of command, verified, prioritized, and stamped urgent, while I was stuck in a blackout tent. The military bureaucracy had located me in a matter of hours. My own flesh and blood hadn't bothered to call me once, except for that single unplayed voicemail. I stared at the 2 clocks on the commander's wall. I had spent months pretending the distance between me and my boy was just geography. It wasn't. It was a terrifying void. The commander finally slid the paper across his desk. "Your family care plan designates your parents," he said, his voice dropping low. "We are nullifying that as of this second. You're going home, Vesper." I stood up. My hands didn't tremble. The military trained the panic out of my physical body long ago. I touched the pocket where my phone sat. I realized then that the voicemail was from Mrs. Gable, and I knew exactly what it contained. Listening to it right then would shatter the ice-cold focus I needed to cross the ocean. I left it unplayed. I had to pack. When the military wants to move you, they move you fast. Within 4 hours, my emergency leave was signed, and I was booked on a transport dropping me in Ohio by the next sunrise. During the layover, texts from Cressida rolled in. She had clearly caught wind that I was inbound. Text 1. So glad you're coming home. It was all a huge misunderstanding. Text 2. Orion is fine. Kids are resilient. Please don't make a scene when you get here. Text 3. Mom was just stressed about the missing brooch. Nobody meant for him to get locked in there. Don't overreact. I read them drinking black coffee at the terminal. I didn't reply once. Instead, I screenshotted every pathetic, self-incriminating message, time-stamped and clear. My sister thought she was controlling the narrative before I landed. She had no idea she was writing my legal evidence for me. Let her keep typing. Every word was another nail in her coffin. She was about to find out what kind of monster a mother becomes when her child is threatened. The final flight into Ohio was pitch black and dead quiet. The cabin was full of exhausted strangers sleeping with their necks bent at awful angles. I had a window seat and absolutely nothing to distract me from the dread sitting heavy in my stomach. I pulled out my phone and stared at the last photo Orion had sent me months before our calls turned into brief, terrified whispers. He was wearing those astronaut pajamas. He had a massive, goofy grin, and you could clearly see the fabric sagging near his collar where the top snap had ripped off in the laundry. I had promised him over a spotty video connection that I would stitch it back together the minute my boots hit home dirt. He had shrugged and told me it didn't matter. It mattered. I stared at that digital image until my eyes burned. Back in my metal footlocker at the forward operating base, I kept a thick stack of his artwork, every single drawing he'd mailed me over the past 9 months. I had handled those papers so many times, the corners were completely rounded off. Sitting on that plane, I finally forced myself to confront the pattern I had been willfully ignoring. In every single picture, the crayon houses, the blue dogs, the bright yellow suns wearing sunglasses, the stick figure version of me wearing a green uniform, my mother was entirely absent. Not one drawing included her. A child illustrates the world he lives in, and my 6-year-old had quietly erased his grandmother from his universe. I should have caught that months ago. I was so consumed with protecting him through official military channels and legal forms that I completely missed the distress signals he was filing in wax crayon, page after agonizing page. The plane finally banked, dropping toward the scattered lights of a country I spent my life defending, while it completely failed to defend my little boy. I shoved the phone into my pocket. I had a job to do on the ground, and guilt is a terrible thing to carry when you need your hands free for a fight. I walked through the automatic sliding doors of the county hospital, still wearing my combat uniform. There had been no time to change, and frankly, no desire to. Heads snapped toward me in the lobby. A military uniform does that to a civilian room. I let them stare. I needed every single ounce of authority that fabric gave me to walk down those sterile hallways without collapsing. A tired triage nurse led me back to the pediatric ward, and there he was. He looked incredibly small in the center of a massive mechanical bed, buried under 3 heated blankets, watching a muted cartoon on a wall-mounted screen. Some color had finally returned to his cheeks. He looked up, he saw me, and his entire body did something I will never get out of my head. It was a frantic upward scramble, reaching for me while simultaneously folding into himself. I had him crushed against my chest before I even realized my boots had crossed the linoleum floor. He smelled like clinical antiseptic soap and my sweet little boy. He didn't shed a single tear. He just gripped my shirt and held on like he was drowning. After a few minutes, he pulled back slightly. He gave the room that same terrified sideways glance he had been doing on the video calls, checking to see if the coast was clear. And then he told me the truth. He spilled it, the way kids do, all in one chaotic, breathless rush. He told me he never touched the pearl brooch. He said he saw it. He told me it was stuffed inside Aunt Crisetta's heavy charcoal gray winter coat, the one with the wooden toggle buttons. He had spotted the pearls shining in the pocket when he was digging around the entryway looking for his missing winter gloves. He went straight to my mother and told her exactly where it was. He dropped his voice to a tiny whisper for the last part. That's when Grandma started screaming. I squeezed his hand. I told him I believed him because I absolutely did. A county child protective services agent found me pacing the hallway near the vending machines about an hour later. Her name badge read Miss Sterling. She had exhausted, fiercely intelligent eyes and carried a thick manila folder clamped under her arm. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She told me a formal welfare investigation had automatically triggered the second the emergency room doctor flagged Orion's hypothermia. She made it crystal clear that the state was moving forward with or without my permission, and that my actions over the next 48 hours would matter significantly more than my apologies. I genuinely liked her for that. She didn't pretend this was a therapy session. She treated it like a rescue mission. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I wanted everything fully on the record. I offered to sign whatever release forms she required and submit to any interview she needed. Then I unzipped my tactical assault pack. I pulled out the waterproof folder I had built by red flashlight in a desert tent, the legal documents nobody in Ohio knew existed. I placed my military family care plan on the plastic table between us. Every single page bore my initials. I explained to Miss Sterling that I had already initiated the legal process to revoke this exact document days before the incident, simply because my son had started flinching at slamming doors on a video screen. I gave her Mrs. Gable's contact information. I gave her the exact dates of the phone calls. Miss Sterling stared at the paperwork for a long time. Then she looked up and asked the brutal question she legally had to ask, just to gauge my reaction. Do you understand what this means? The people listed on your military file are the exact people who put him in that hospital bed. I understand completely, I told her, my voice dead flat. It means their authority ends today. She clicked her pen and started writing. For the first time since my commander handed me that dispatch, I felt the earth stop spinning. My paperwork had teeth. I finally knew whose throats they were going to rip out. My parents finally showed up at the hospital ward that evening. Cressida, predictably, did not. My mother pushed through the swinging double doors, already running her mouth, which is exactly how she enters any space she intends to control. She marched toward me with a fully fabricated narrative locked and loaded. "Thank God we were home," she announced, waving her hands dramatically. She claimed the entire situation was blown wildly out of proportion by a hysterical, nosy neighbor. She called Orion a deeply troubled child. She looked me in the eye and said I had no idea what kind of nightmare they dealt with on a daily basis. My stepfather stood 2 paces behind her, intently studying the floor tiles like he was trying to memorize the grout lines. I didn't interrupt her. I let my mother talk, mostly because Miss Sterling had just walked out of an adjacent room and was standing directly behind her. She hadn't noticed her yet. She gained momentum, her voice echoing off the hard hospital walls. She repeated the exact vile sentence she'd used the night before, reciting it like a badge of honor. "He's a thief, just like his dead father. We refuse to harbor a criminal in our home." She said it loudly. She said it while standing in a pediatric recovery wing, and as the words left her mouth, Miss Sterling stood 3 feet away, her pen completely frozen over her notepad. The caseworker was listening to a grown woman label a 6-year-old a criminal in the exact hospital where doctors had just spent hours raising his core body temperature back to normal. My mother finally took a breath. waiting for me to back down and apologize the way I had done my entire childhood. I gave her nothing. I just stared at a spot over her left shoulder. She finally turned her head. She saw the caseworker's badge. I stood there and watched my mother process, about 3 seconds too late, exactly who had just heard her confession. I need to pause right here. If you have ever stood in a sterile hospital corridor and realized with absolute certainty that the people entrusted to protect your child are the monsters who nearly killed him, you already understand why my hands weren't shaking. Utter, freezing steadiness is what replaces your panic when the worst thing finally happens. That night in the hospital, I made a tactical decision that probably looked like weakness to my family. I turned to my mother and softly suggested we all sit down as a family at their house the following day. I specifically requested that Cressida be there. I kept my voice gentle, my posture relaxed, offering an olive branch that a narcissist could never resist. My mother heard the phrase "family sit down" and her shoulders instantly dropped. In her mind, that phrase meant a controlled environment where she held the gavel and got the final word. She agreed immediately. I had been calculating this move for 24 hours. I didn't want a screaming match in a hospital hallway where security could throw us out. I wanted the absolute truth dragged into the light in their living room, the one place my sister couldn't retreat from. Cressida had been hiding in that house while our parents took the heat for her disgusting lie. I wanted Mrs. Gable sitting right there in the room. I wanted Miss Sterling there, because a state caseworker is legally permitted to observe family mediations, and some confessions need to be made in front of a person with a state-issued pen. I wasn't setting a trap for innocent people. I was simply locking the doors on a room where a guilty person would run out of places to hide. There is a massive difference, and my conscience is entirely clear. My mother told me to come over right at noon. She smiled tightly and said Cressida would be thrilled to finally clear the air. "I'm sure she will be," I replied. I walked back into Orion's room, looked at the frayed collar of his pajamas, and took a deep breath. Tomorrow, we burn it down. We assembled in their living room at right noon. My stepfather sank in his worn recliner. My mother claimed the center of the floral sofa. Cressida sat right beside her, legs elegantly crossed, wearing the serene, slightly bored expression of a woman preparing to generously forgive a massive misunderstanding. Miss Sterling sat quietly in a dining chair near the window, her notebook resting on her knee. Mrs. Gable had walked across the lawn and taken a seat right by the front door, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I refused to sit. I stayed on my feet, leaning against the archway. It's a habit you pick up when you need a room to shut up and listen. Cressida took the floor first. She used her smoothest corporate marketing voice. She talked about how glad she was that we could handle this like adults. She spun a tragic tale about Orion having a compulsion for taking things that didn't belong to him. She reframed a child freezing on a concrete floor as a desperate plea for boundaries. I'll admit, she was incredibly polished. She almost made child abuse sound like a progressive parenting technique. When she finally stopped talking, I looked right at her and asked one very simple question. "Where is your charcoal gray winter coat, the one with the wooden toggles that usually hangs by the back sunroom door?" The air in the living room stopped moving. Cressida blinked, entirely losing her rhythm. She stammered that she didn't see what her outerwear had to do with my kid's behavior. I kept my voice dead level. I told Orion had seen the pearl brooch shoved deep inside her coat pocket days ago. I told him he had reported it to our mother, and that was the exact moment the screaming started. Before my sister could pivot, Mrs. Gable stood up. Her voice cut through the room like glass. She explained that she had picked Cressida's heavy coat off the floor the morning the paramedics arrived. She felt a heavy lump in the pocket. She reached in and she pulled out the vintage pearl brooch. Miss Sterling looked up from her notes. Is that coat still hanging by the door? My stepfather, delivering his only sentence of the afternoon, rasped, Yes, it is. Cressida whipped her head toward our mother, desperately waiting to be rescued. For the first time in 60 years, my mother sat there with her mouth shut. A lie that massive doesn't just fade away, it thrashes violently before it dies. By the time I walked out of their front door and got to my rental car, my phone was already vibrating. The family panic had officially set in. I know the exact timeline now because half of my relatives snitched on themselves trying to do damage control. At 8:02 p.m., Cressida called our older cousin, Marlene. At 8:15 p.m., Marlene called my mother. At 8:40 p.m., my mother called me. I watched her name flash on the screen and let it ring until it hit voicemail. At 9:10 p.m., an aunt who hadn't bothered to speak to me in 3 years sent a massive text paragraph. She claimed she always knew I was the strong one in the family and begged to know what she could do to help. Absolutely nothing, I thought, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. There is nothing you can do today that you couldn't have done by simply driving over and checking on my son any time in the last 9 months. I didn't type that out. I typed nothing at all. Somewhere between the desert base and that suffocating living room, I finally learned that silence isn't a symptom of weakness. When deployed correctly, silence is a brick wall, and I held the only key to the gate. My family desperately wanted me to revert to my old role, the peacekeeper, the shock absorber, the daughter who smoothed over the rough edges and explained away the abuse. That version of me died overseas. Just before midnight, one final notification lit up the dark hotel room. I actually stared at this one. It was a direct message from my stepfather. No group chat, no audience to perform for, just one pathetic sentence. Can I come see him? I hovered my thumb over the screen for a solid minute. Then I flipped the phone face down on the nightstand and switched off the lamp. Some questions do not deserve an immediate answer. Sometimes you have to let a grown man sit alone in the dark with his choices, exactly the way he forced a 6-year-old to sit alone in the freezing cold. My mother, completely incapable of sitting with her guilt, stormed the county hospital the next morning. She marched up to the pediatric desk and loudly demanded access to her grandson's room. I was standing right by Orion's bed when the charge nurse told her she was barred from entry. Ms. Sterling had filed an emergency protection order late the previous night. It's a swift administrative lock they use when a child has been severely endangered by their primary caretakers. That legal barrier meant my mother didn't get to waltz into her recovery room just because she felt entitled to her presence. Her voice spiked into that familiar, shrill frequency. She yelled at the nursing staff about her grandparents' rights. She insisted that blood was blood and that I had no authority to sever a boy from his real family. Finally, she glared through the glass partition directly at me, expecting me to cave and override the staff. It was a reflex built over 34 years of conditioning. I held her gaze through the glass. I gave her absolute silence. Ms. Sterling stepped directly into my mother's path, planting her feet like a concrete bollard. Actually, ma'am, the caseworker said, her tone entirely stripped of emotion, she holds all the authority. It landed like a judge's gavel. My mother stared at the caseworker, completely paralyzed. I genuinely think it was the very first time in her adult life that another woman had flat out overruled her. She looked back at me, searching for a lifeline. I just watched her. She had spent my entire existence dictating my boundaries. She never imagined a day when a government employee with a clipboard would enforce a boundary against her on my behalf. This is the fundamental reality my family never grasped. They assumed my physical distance meant I was legally helpless. They had the power dynamic completely reversed. I was the sole surviving parent. That military family care plan was my document to draft and my document to burn. The moment the state proved the designated caretakers had abused my dependent, the plan ceased being their legal shield. It became their signed confession. The military attorney walked me through the revocation on a secure line, step by agonizing step. I formally dissolved their guardianship in black ink. That one sheet of paper hit harder than a decade of screaming. Orion was discharged into my custody, and Aunt Linnea was legally established as his permanent guardian if I ever deployed again. No hidden tricks, no screaming matches. I simply told the truth to the people who hold the power, and I brought the receipts. My mother spent her whole life making the rules, but she never bothered to read the paperwork. My family severely underestimated the quiet daughter. They didn't realize that a pen, when held by the right person, absolutely decimates a screaming match. That evening, I sat on the edge of Orion's hospital mattress, holding a needle and thread. The hospital staff had allowed me to pack a small bag for my parents' house, and those astronaut pajamas were right on top. They still carried the faint, powdery scent of my mother's detergent. The collar still hung loose where the snap had ripped off months ago. I had hauled a tactical sewing kit across a desert for 9 months to patch up combat gear, yet I had never used it on my own kids' clothes. Orion watched my hands work. He asked if he could wear them to sleep, even though they were the exact clothes he froze in. I kept my expression entirely blank and told him yes. He slid them on and traced the replacement button. It was a mismatched yellow star I found at a terminal gift shop. He pointed out that it didn't look like the others. It doesn't, I told him. Sometimes a piece falls off, and the new piece looks completely different, but the shirt still does its job. He chewed on his bottom lip. Without looking up from the yellow star, he whispered the question that was eating him alive. He asked if he was in trouble. He asked if the screaming and the cold were his fault. I looked at him and said no. I said it with the most solid, unshakable voice I have ever managed in my life. Then I made an excuse about needing ice water. I walked out into the fluorescent hallway and leaned heavily against the plaster wall, perfectly out of his sightline. Even a soldier has a breaking point, and hearing my 6-year-old take the blame for an adult's cruelty was mine. The one enemy I hadn't properly mapped out was the calendar. Military emergency leave has a hard expiration date. I was operating on borrowed days, and my unit was running drills on the other side of the planet without me. The custody plan with Aunt Linnea was solid, but there was a legally vulnerable window between my leave ending and a judge stamping the permanent transfer. My mother knew exactly how to exploit a gap. She hired a shark of an attorney. Miss Sterling handed me the letter in the cafeteria. It was 3 pages of heavy cardstock weaponizing the phrase, grandparents' rights. The lawyer argued that yanking Orion from his established residence would cause severe psychological trauma. Worse, the letter twisted my deployment, the literal reason they had him in the first place, into evidence that I was an unstable absentee mother. I read the document twice. Then I pulled up the calendar on my phone. I calculated the days left on my leave against the glacial pace of family court. The math was brutal. My family had located the single structural flaw in my defense. They were going to use my military oath to steal my son. That night was the closest I have ever come to totally snapping. Orion was sedated and sleeping. The hospital had settled into that eerie, humming midnight quiet where you feel entirely alone in the universe. I held the lawyer's threat in one hand and my leave orders in the other. If I deployed, my mother's lawyer would rip the gap wide open. If I went AIW to stay with him, I lost my career, my income, and eventually custody. I slid down the cold corridor wall until I hit the floor. I pulled my knees tight against my chest, realizing with a sickening jolt that I was sitting in the exact physical posture my son had taken on that freezing sunroom floor. I allowed myself to panic for exactly 5 minutes. I let the absolute worst-case scenarios run wild in my brain. Then I did the only thing I know how to do. I stood back up. My kid was sleeping 10 feet away wearing a mismatched button. A boy who survives a locked door in the winter shouldn't wake up to find his rescuer curled in a ball on the linoleum. I walked down to the lobby and made a phone call. The military is a massive, unforgiving machine, but when you bleed for it, sometimes it bleeds for you. I called my commanding officer. I bypassed the pride and laid out the entire miserable situation: the lawyer, the expiring leave, the custody trap. I had never asked the brass for a personal favor in my entire career. I asked now, and the massive bureaucracy that shipped me across an ocean slowly pivoted to defend my flank. The base legal office drafted a savage counterfiling. My commander rammed through a hardship extension on my leave and initiated a compassionate reassignment to a base 3 hours from Aunt Linnea's house. It wasn't magic, but it was real. My mother's expensive lawyer suddenly found himself fighting the United States Department of Defense. Right in the thick of this, my stepfather called my cell phone. No audience, no screaming women in the background. He choked on Orion's name, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since his brother died. I heard him pounding on the glass, he whispered. I should have unlocked it. It was the most honest sentence he ever spoke. I let the dead air stretch. I know you heard him, I replied. Hearing the noise and turning the deadbolt are two different things. Only the second one matters. He didn't argue. He couldn't. He was a week too late, and we both knew his apology was useless. If you're wondering if I screamed at them during our final meeting in their living room, the answer is no. I learned in combat that the person raising their voice is usually the person losing the firefight. Miss Sterling laid out the reality with bureaucratic precision. The state investigation was officially closed. The finding was severe neglect, substantiated and permanently etched onto their records. The military care plan was completely voided. They were legally barred from unsupervised contact. My mother lost her mind. She shot off the floral sofa, screaming that she had raised 3 daughters perfectly, and this was a conspiracy to alienate her from her bloodline. Cressida chimed in, her voice shrill and panicked, insisting the coat proved nothing and whining that I was acting superior. They fed off each other, filling the room with deafening, desperate noise. I stood leaning against the archway, completely still. I waited until their lungs gave out. Then I spoke so quietly they had to hold their breath to hear me. You don't get a vote on my kid anymore, I said. You spent your final vote the second you turned that deadbolt. Cressida glared at me. This isn't fair, Vesper. I actually laughed, a short, hollow sound. Fairness was the broken floodlight you refused to fix. Fairness was my mother's jewelry sitting in your coat pocket while a 6-year-old froze on concrete. I didn't elevate my pitch once. I have navigated active mortar fire that felt less chaotic than my mother's living room. Then, I finally opened the waterproof folder. I dealt the documents onto their glass coffee table like I was throwing down a winning poker hand. The revoked care plan, Mrs. Gable's handwritten, time-stamped testimony, the hospital intake forms detailing Orion's plummeting core temperature, and finally, crisp, printed screenshots of Cressida's frantic text messages. I didn't explain a single page. I let the evidence speak. Miss Sterling delivered the final blow. She opened her notebook and read my mother's own hospital rant aloud. The sentence about Orion being a thief who sleeps outside echoed in the quiet room, stripped of my mother's self-righteous tone, delivered in the flat cadence of a government employee. My mother physically recoiled. It was the very first time she actually heard how monstrous her own words sounded when spoken by a stranger. She covered her mouth with a shaking hand. It was the first time in my life I watched her want to swallow her words, and she absolutely couldn't. Cressida stared at the printed screenshots of her texts like they were written in a foreign language. My stepfather just stared at his own hands, the same hands that sat idle in his lap while a little boy pounded on a glass door. The fallout wasn't explosive. It was just permanent. Orion was legally mine, with Aunt Linnea holding the backup guardianship. My military transfer was approved, and Cressida, who started this entire fire just to secure her free ride, got her wish. My stepfather finally found a spine and told her to pack her bags, but a month later she crawled back. Now the three of them rot in that house together, a house no grandchild will ever step foot inside, filled with people who can't even look each other in the eye over morning coffee. We left on a brutally overcast afternoon. I held a single duffel bag in one hand and Orion's hand in the other. Nobody escorted us out. We walked down the front path, right past that sunroom. The shattered floodlight was still dead. After an ambulance, a CPS investigation, and losing their grandson, they still hadn't changed the bulb. Fixing it would mean admitting they left him in the dark. Orion stopped at the sidewalk. He turned and stared at the dark glass for a long time, just making sure the monster was really behind him. Then he squeezed my hand and said he was ready to go. We got into the rental car and drove away under a gray sky, leaving the darkness exactly where it belonged. 6 weeks later, my transfer cleared. We rent a small house near the new base, just a 20-minute drive from Aunt Linnea's place. Orion has a bedroom with a massive window that catches the morning sun. He sleeps with the hallway lamp burning bright every single night, and I haven't said a word about the electric bill. A kid who survived the dark gets to dictate exactly how much light he needs. Those astronaut pajamas eventually wore through the knees. The yellow star button was hanging by a single thread by the time he finally outgrew them. I didn't toss them in the trash. I folded them neatly in the bottom of a cedar drawer. You don't keep things because they fit. You keep them as proof that you survived. He doesn't flinch at slamming doors anymore. It took months of patience. I just made sure I answered every knock myself, proving that doors in our house are meant to be opened. Yesterday, he rambled for 20 minutes through dinner about a weird bug he found at recess, and he never once checked the room to see if I was annoying me. If you want to know if I forgave my family, you're asking the wrong question. I didn't build a prison for my parents. I built a solid door, and I controlled the deadbolt. Protecting your peace isn't revenge. Our new house has a front porch. Before I unpacked a single box, I unscrewed the fixture and put in a brand new motion sensor bulb. It snaps on the second your foot hits the bottom step. Orion thinks it's a game. He runs up and down just to watch it flare to life. I let him do it all night if he wants to. That's the entire point of the light.